During the Electronic Defense Task Force Summit that I attended, it became quite clear that there was serious pushback from the very industry we were trying to protect. And just as it is for our adversaries, the pushback was based on economics. While we were at the conference, the Electric Power and Research Institute, it's called EPRI for short, released a study that severely downplayed the risks of an EMP on our grid. Now, the scientists I was with and the engineers I was with all considered this to be junk science or science denial. In fact, many of the key people pulled together an impromptu press conference to address the EPRI report. They believe that the power industry and their lobby is working overtime to avoid having to provide full EMP protection in line with the President's executive order. Can this be true? Would an adversary really work for their own interests and profit against the needs of our society? Obviously, we don't have to look very far to see some examples of that, where that's taken place. To help you understand, let me share with you just a couple of stories where a particular industry put their financial benefit above the public's welfare using pseudoscientific studies. The first and the worst is satirized in the novel of the same name, Thank You for Smoking. Thank You for Smoking? Yes, it's a story, a novel, about the truth that happened in the 1950s to the 1980s, where the tobacco industry advertised to kids and glorified junk science studies, even sometimes claiming that smoking was healthy and good for you. They said that it improved your throat and helped you remove irritation. But it's not just the tobacco industry. Even our military has had periods where a special interest used junk science to override better judgment for the greater good. Do you know, for example, that there were serious military studies in the early part of the last century attempting to keep a horse culture even when motorized vehicles had taken the lead? Remember the taxis of the Marne? That was World War I. Automobiles were taking the lead. What did we show up with? We showed up with the cavalry, but I mean real horses. Yeah, there's a certain romance to it. But why did Americans insist on taking horses to battle? You don't see horses leading the cavalry charges in modern warfare. Why? The truth is that the cavalry units themselves commissioned really sciencey sounding studies that said that having horses on the battle improved the IQ of the soldiers. I'm not kidding. General Quast told me that. He read these studies. And he said if you didn't know better, they sounded like they were right. The arguments seemed profound. But think about it. The old cavalryman General Patton, from his younger days, he didn't take horses in the Battle of the Bulge. He rolled with tanks, not a horse. The point is this: it's human nature to protect our positions. And there are science deniers in the utility industry who are afraid to admit that a high-altitude nuclear explosion could be devastating to our grid. So they use junk science and obfuscation to avoid dealing with what would be a costly problem. Maybe they're afraid that the grid is kind of patched together and not as resilient as it really should be. And if we start digging into resilience, maybe it will cost the utility industry more than we think it should cost just to protect from an EMP. So the EPRI report downplayed the risk of an EMP. They didn't run the in-depth analysis of the Congressional EMP Commission, for example, and they didn't even coordinate with them. They didn't run the in-depth analysis of the military who's looked at the EMP and the impacts it could have, and it sounds like that the limits that they put on the source and the pulse and the size of that EMP blast were a lot lower than our military feels we should prepare for. In other words, the EMP Commission says that maybe this was garbage in and garbage out. Maybe the EPRI study is created to let utilities off the hook rather than to fully examine the problem. Maybe the EPRI study had a foregone conclusion that they were trying to reach. What's worse, the analysis was paid for by the very industry seeking to avoid additional oversight. Sounds a lot like Thank You for Smoking,